June 1462, the road to Targovište. The Ottoman scouts arrived first, as they always did, moving ahead of the main column. Eyes trained for ambush, blades ready. They had marched through conquered lands before. They knew what victory looked like. They knew what defeat smelled like, but they had never seen this. The forest opened into a clearing and the horses stopped. Not because of enemy lines, not because of fortifications or fire. They stopped because the men riding them could not process what lay ahead. A field, no, a forest, but not of trees. 20,000 stakes, maybe more, arranged in perfect rows, stretching nearly a mile, and on each one a body, men, women, children, Ottoman soldiers, merchants, civilians from occupied villages, left to rot under the sun, some for weeks. The scouts did not advance. They did not speak. One of them vomited. Another turned his horse and rode back the way they came. When the main army arrived hours later, Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, destroyer of Byzantium, stood at the edge of that clearing and stared. His officers waited for orders. None came. This was not war. This was not even cruelty. This was a message, and it had been written specifically for him. The Sultan had expected resistance. He had crushed it before. He had walked over the bones of empires older and stronger than Wallachia. But this was something else. This was fear-made architecture, horror-made policy. One of his commanders, a man who had fought in a dozen campaigns, reportedly whispered, "We are not fighting a man." Mehmed ordered the army to turn back. Not retreat, not withdrawal, just away. Away from the stakes, away from the smell, away from whatever kind of mind could orchestrate this. History would call it the night attack, the forest of the impaled, a turning point. But for the women taken captive in the months before, those still alive in Vlad's dungeons, those who had seen what happened to the others, it was not a turning point. It was a preview. The day the Ottomans felt fear was not the day it began. It was the day the world finally noticed. Vlad Draculaeus was not born a monster. He was made into one. 1444, Vlad was 13 years old when his father handed him over to the Ottoman Sultan, not as a prisoner, as a guarantee, a living contract. His younger brother Radu went with him. This was how empires controlled borderlands. You didn't need to occupy every village or station troops in every castle. You just took the children of rulers and raised them in your court. You taught them your language, your religion, your wars, and if their fathers betrayed you, you killed the sons. Wallachia had no choice. It sat wedged between the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, two powers that could crush it without effort. Survival meant bending, compromise, sacrifice, and the first thing sacrificed was always the vulnerable. Vlad spent years in the Ottoman palace at Edirne. He learned Turkish, he studied military tactics, he watched how the Sultan's court operated, how power moved, how loyalty was bought, how fear was cultivated. He also learned what happened to those who resisted. Torture was not hidden in the Ottoman court, it was administrative, efficient, public when it needed to be. Vlad saw men impaled for rebellion. He saw women taken as spoils after raids, divided among officers like grain or livestock. He saw how empire sustained itself not through inspiration but through the constant application of controlled violence. And he saw how his brother Radu adapted. Radu converted to Islam. He became a favourite of the Sultan, charming and compliant. He thrived. Vlad did not. Vlad remained orthodox, stubborn, silent. He was beaten for it, humiliated. Some chronicles suggest worse, but he survived. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia in 1448, he was no longer the boy who had left. He had learned the language of empires. He understood that cruelty was not emotional, it was operational. Violence was a tool, fear was a currency, and women had always been part of the transaction. His father, Vlad II Draculaeus, had spent years balancing between Ottoman and Hungarian interests, offering tribute, hostages, loyalty. It hadn't saved him. In 1447, Hungarian-backed nobles murdered him. They buried Vlad's older brother alive. No diplomacy, no compromise, no mercy. Vlad learned the lesson. Appeasement bought you nothing. Power respected only power. And if you wanted to survive between empires, you had to become something they feared more than they feared each other. He did not invent impalement. The Ottomans used it. So did the Hungarians, so did the Byzantines before them. It was already a language everyone spoke. Vlad just became fluent. By the time he took the throne for the second time in 1456, he had a vision. Wallachia would not be a borderland. It would not be a buffer. It would be a warning. But warnings require examples, and examples require victims. When Ottoman women were taken during Vlad's raids, they did not appear in official records. There were no prisoner exchanges, no ransom negotiations, no letters sent back to families. They simply vanished from one world and reappeared in another, one where their names no longer mattered. This was not unusual. War had always worked this way. Women on the losing side became property. They were absorbed into the victor's household, his army's camp, his economy. Some became servants, others concubines. A few, if they were fortunate and high-born, might be married off to secure alliances. But Vlad's Wallachia was not interested in alliances. The women taken from Ottoman-controlled villages, wives of soldiers, daughters of administrators, civilians who had the misfortune of living near the border, were brought to fortresses deep in the Carpathian valleys. Places with no names on maps, places where screams didn't travel. They were kept in conditions that made survival itself a form of suffering. Cold stone floors, no sunlight, minimal food, enough to live but not enough to resist. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the waiting. Because Vlad didn't need them for labour. He didn't need them for ransom. He didn't even need them for pleasure. Though some of his men took what they wanted, he needed them for something else. In medieval warfare, captives had value. They could be traded, sold, or converted into political leverage. But Vlad understood something darker. Captives also had symbolic value. A captured soldier could be ransomed. A captured woman could be erased, and erasure was its own kind of weapon. Ottoman commanders knew their men were being impaled. They had seen the stakes. They had smelled the bodies. But soldiers expected to die in war. That was the contract. What they did not expect, what no one expected, was for their women to suffer fates worse than their own. There are fragments in the chronicles. A Wallachian boyar's letter mentions Turkish women detained and delivered to the prince's justice. Another account refers to captives made example, so that their kin might know despair. The language is vague, deliberately so, because what happened next was not meant to be recorded. It was meant to be whispered, rumoured, feared. Some of the women were impaled. Not quickly as soldiers might be, but slowly, positioned so that death would take hours, sometimes days. They were placed near roads where Ottoman patrols might find them, or left near villages that had once paid tribute to the Sultan. Others were mutilated in ways designed to send specific messages. Hands removed, tongues cut out, faces marked, not because Vlad hated them personally. He didn't know them. He had no reason to hate them. But he knew the men who would find them, and he knew what those men would feel. Rage, yes, but also something more corrosive, doubt. If the Sultan could not protect his own people, if the empire's reach could not prevent this, then what was the empire worth? Some women were kept alive longer, forced to watch what happened to others, forced to imagine what might happen to them. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical. Fear compounded, isolation deepened. A few may have been released, returned to Ottoman lines not as survivors, but as warnings, living testimonies of what Vlad was willing to do, and that was the cruelty of it. The ones who died suffered, but the ones who lived carried the horror back with them, infecting the Ottoman ranks with something no army could defend against: doubt, dread, the creeping suspicion that they were not fighting a man, but a force that operated outside the rules every empire had agreed upon. Vlad had turned captivity itself into a weapon, and the victims were women whose names we will never know. Vlad did not impale women because he was insane. He did it because it worked. War at its core is psychological. Swords and armies matter, but what truly breaks an enemy is the moment they stop believing in victory. The moment fear becomes more persuasive than duty. Vlad understood this better than most rulers of his time. He had studied the Ottomans from the inside. He knew their strengths, discipline, numbers, resources, but he also knew their assumptions. They expected resistance to follow certain patterns. Castles would be defended, armies would meet in open fields, diplomacy would be attempted. Vlad rejected all of it. He didn't defend castles, he emptied them and burned the surrounding villages so the Ottomans would have nothing to supply their army. He didn't meet them in open battle, he struck at night, slaughtering soldiers in their sleep, then vanished into the forests. And he didn't negotiate. Instead, he made sure every Ottoman advance came with a cost they couldn't calculate. The impaled women were not collateral damage. They were the message itself. When Ottoman soldiers found the bodies of their comrades on stakes, it was horrifying but comprehensible. Soldiers die. That's war. But when they found women from their own settlements, women they might have known, women whose suffering had clearly been prolonged and purposeful, it crossed a line that even hardened warriors recognized. This was not about territory anymore. This was a sentinel, and that was exactly what Vlad wanted. There's a chronicle from a Byzantine Greek who travelled with the Ottoman army during one of Mehmed's campaigns into Wallachia. He describes the soldiers' reactions when they came across a group of impaled captives near a burned village. The men wept, he wrote, not from pity alone, but from rage they could not direct. The enemy was nowhere, only his work remained. Rage without a target is paralysing, it turns inward. It breaks morale faster than any defeat. Vlad also understood spectacle. The impaled women were not hidden. They were displayed. Placed along roads the Ottomans would travel, positioned near water sources where soldiers would have to stop, arranged in ways that forced the enemy to see them, to smell them, to walk past them. Some were dressed in the remains of Ottoman clothing, deliberate reminder of who they had been. Others were left naked, stripped of identity entirely, reduced to pure symbol. It was theatre, brutal, calculated theatre. And it had an audience. Because Vlad knew that soldiers talk, they write letters home, they tell stories around fires, and those stories spread. Within months, rumours about Vlad reached Constantinople, then Cairo, then Venice. He became known not for his victories, he won very few, but for his methods. The Ottomans had faced fierce resistance before. They had fought the Serbs, the Hungarians, the Byzantines. But those enemies fought to win. Vlad fought to make winning feel like losing. One account claims that Mehmed II himself, after seeing the forest of the impaled, said to his advisors, "I cannot be expected to conquer the land of a man who does such things. Whether he truly said it or not doesn't matter." The story spread, and stories in war are often more powerful than facts. Vlad's strategy relied on one key insight. Empires are not just military machines, they are psychological constructs. They depend on the belief that expansion is inevitable, that resistance is futile, that the cost of defiance is always higher than submission. By making the cost of conquest unbearable, not in lives lost but in horrors witnessed, Vlad shattered that belief. The impaled women were proof that there were fates worse than defeat, that some enemies would go further than you were willing to go, that the rules you thought governed warfare were not universal, and once that belief takes root, an army stops advancing. Not because it can't, because it doesn't want to. There's a reason the Ottomans, despite their overwhelming superiority, never fully conquered Wallachia during Vlad's reign. They installed puppet rulers, they occupied fortresses, but they never stayed, because staying meant existing in a state of constant gnawing dread. It meant wondering if the women in the next village, your women, would be next. It meant questioning whether victory was worth the price of your own sanity. Vlad didn't win through strength. He won by making his enemies too afraid to win, and the cost of that victory was paid in flesh that was never buried, in suffering that was never recorded, in women whose names were deliberately forgotten, so their deaths could serve a purpose larger than their lives ever had. History remembers Vlad as a defender of Christendom, a hero who stood against the Ottoman tide. But the women on those stakes were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were messages, written in blood for an empire to read. The Ottoman Empire kept meticulous records, tax rolls, military rosters, treaties, diplomatic correspondence. The names of governors, generals, janissaries, even minor officials were documented, their appointments noted, their salaries recorded. But the women taken during Vlad's campaigns, they left almost no trace, no lists of captives, no demands for their return, no official inquiries into their fate. The empire that chronicled everything chose to chronicle nothing about them. This was not an oversight, it was a choice, because acknowledging what happened to those women would have required the empire to admit something it could not afford to admit, that it had failed to protect its own people, that its expansion into Christian Europe came at a cost it preferred not to calculate. Empires are built on the illusion of inevitability, the idea that conquest is natural, that resistance is futile, that the march of power cannot be stopped. But illusions require maintenance. They require selective memory. The Ottomans recorded their victories in Wallachia. They documented the eventual removal of Vlad from power, his imprisonment, his death. They celebrated the rulers they installed in his place, compliant men who understood their role. But the women, the ones whose bodies had been used as psychological weapons, they vanished from the official narrative entirely, because to remember them would be to remember fear. and empires cannot afford to be seen as afraid. This pattern repeats throughout history. Atrocities committed against women during wartime are often the first casualties of political convenience, not because they matter less, but because they complicate the story victors want to tell. If the Ottomans acknowledged what Vlad did to their female captives, they would have to explain why they didn't retaliate in kind, why they didn't escalate, why, despite their vastly superior forces, they pulled back. The answer was simple: because Vlad had found the one thing even the most powerful empire couldn't defend against, the willingness to go further. There are hints, though, fragments that survived in places the empire couldn't control. A Venetian merchant's letter describes hearing from Ottoman traders about the Wallachians' cruelties, which no man speaks of in the Sultan's presence, for fear of reminding him of his retreat. A Serbian monk's chronicle mentions Turkish women lost to the devil's work whose suffering the faithful prayed would end, though none knew if it had. Even these are vague, second-hand, stripped of detail, because the details were too dangerous, not militarily, politically. To document what happened would be to admit that the empire's reach had limits, that its soldiers could be made to feel helpless, that its promise of protection was conditional. And so the women disappeared twice, once in life when they were taken, and again in death, when their suffering was erased from memory. This is how history protects power, not by lying outright, but by choosing what to forget, by deciding whose pain is worth recording and whose can be quietly buried beneath the weight of more important events. The fall of Constantinople, documented in exhaustive detail, the campaigns into Hungary chronicled from every angle, but the women impaled along Wallachian roads, footnotes at best, more often nothing at all. Vlad, ironically, fared better in historical memory. His cruelty was recorded, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes sanitized, but always present. He became a legend, a vampire, a monster. The women became nothing, not because their suffering was less, but because their suffering was inconvenient. The Ottoman Empire would go on to rule for centuries after Vlad's death. It would expand further, conquer more, become one of the most powerful states in human history, but it never returned to Wallachia with the same confidence. Not because it couldn't, because somewhere in the collective memory of the army, in the whispered stories passed between soldiers, there remained an understanding. Some enemies cannot be defeated by superior force, some horrors cannot be answered with greater violence, and some prices are too high, even for an empire. The women who paid that price were never compensated, never honoured, never even named. They existed only as a lesson the empire learned but refused to teach, a warning written in flesh then erased from the page, so that history could move on and power could remain untarnished. Vlad Dracula died in 1476. The exact circumstances are unclear, ambushed by Ottoman forces, or betrayed by his own men, or both. His head was sent to Constantinople, preserved in honey, displayed as proof that the monster was finally dead. Within decades, his story began to transform. German pamphlets circulated tales of his cruelty, illustrated with woodcuts of forests thick with impaled bodies. These weren't condemnations, they were entertainment. Horror stories sold to a public fascinated by the exotic brutality of Eastern Europe. By the 19th century, Vlad had become Dracula, a vampire, immortal, a creature who drank blood and feared the cross. The historical figure dissolved into fiction, his actual crimes replaced by supernatural metaphor. He became a legend, an icon, a character in novels, films, and, eventually, theme parks. But the women, the ones whose suffering made his reputation, they became nothing. No legends, no stories, no names. History chose to remember the man who orchestrated the horror. It forgot the women who endured it. This is not unique to Vlad's story, it's the pattern. Conquerors are remembered, empires are studied, battles are analysed, but the women caught between them, the ones whose bodies became battlegrounds, whose suffering was used as strategy, they disappear. Not because their pain was less real, but because acknowledging it complicates the narratives we prefer to tell. We want history to be about heroes and villains, great men and their great deeds. We want clear morals, decisive victories, lessons we can apply. But what lesson does a nameless woman on a stake teach us? What glory is there in her suffering? What inspiration in her erasure? None. So we look away. We turn Vlad into a myth because myths are easier than truth. We make him a vampire because vampires can be defeated with stakes and sunlight. We place him safely in the realm of fiction, where his cruelty becomes spectacle rather than history. but the women were real. They had names we'll never know, lives we'll never recover, families who mourned them in ways no chronicle bothered to record. And their absence from history is not an accident. It's a choice we continue to make. Every time we tell Vlad's story and forget theirs, every time we focus on the strategy and ignore the cost, every time we ask how he did it, but never who it was done to. The question isn't whether Vlad was a monster. The question is why we remember monsters better than we remember their victims, why his face appears in museums while theirs are lost, why his name endures while theirs were never recorded in the first place. History is not a neutral record, it's a curated collection, and what we choose to preserve reveals more about us than it does about the past. We preserved the forest of the impaled as a symbol of resistance. We forgot the women in that forest were human beings,